Hey guys, it's Micah. My channel's been a wasteland for quite some time, and I'd like to start trying to make videos again about a topic that I love, but I know that most of you hate: politics. I'm obsessed with politics and ideologies in general, why people think different things, and I'd say I've been outspoken all my life. I know it's a contentious thing to make videos about, and many of you who subscribe to me are probably groaning right now, and I'm sorry about that. But recently, the political situation has grown into something that can't be ignored, and I, being self-centered old me, would like to contribute my own voice to the conversation. Now, if I'm to make more videos in the future on this topic, I feel obliged to start out with a baseline to reveal my political philosophy and my journey in its entirety, so in the future, you all can understand where exactly I'm coming from whenever I speak out on these matters. I don't expect to persuade many people, and that isn't exactly my goal. My only goal is to be understood and to have people recognize where I come from, in order to understand why people may hold similar beliefs to me. I have a constant urge to explain how I feel, but my current ideology is a bit on the fringe, hence all the exposition that I feel obliged to add to the mix. So if I keep making political videos, expect this one to be a building block to everything that I make in the future, a reference you can go back on if you seek to understand my perspective, at least for now. First things first, to understand my worldview, you need to understand how I evolved to take it. So let's take a little dive into my past, shall we? I grew up in Kentucky with a white, I should add, conservative Christian family. Everyone in my family, including me, is religious to this day, and without a doubt, these religious beliefs influence the politics I grew up surrounded by. Since my dad was always politically involved, he was the person I first began pulling views from. I remember when I was really young, I asked Dad, "Why are we Republicans? What do Democrats believe?" Or something like that. And my dad told me that Democrats wanted everything to be fair, in a negative way like that. Now, as a kid, my first reaction was, well, yeah, I want everything to be fair. So my dad had to explain to me that what they wanted wasn't really fairness, but it could seem like it, which was dangerous. And so I grew up with this sort of mindset, constantly listening to Rush Limbaugh in the car with my dad, and I embraced their politics very fast. Soon enough, I was able to articulate why I held these beliefs a little bit better. In like 5th grade, I was explaining to my friend why we couldn't tax the rich higher, why I was against gay marriage, why I wanted to make abortion illegal, etc. At this time, around Obama's re-election, I was pretty young and already incredibly passionate about politics and not afraid to trumpet my beliefs. I also took on this mindset that anyone voting for the opposite party was on the enemy team, which I'm sure a lot of people strongly believe and grew up believing. I remember seeing Obama yard signs and stickers and just perceiving that these people were on the other side. A relationship with someone who disagreed with me, I imagined, would be incredibly hard to maintain. And that specifically became true for me going into middle school, when I was automatically attracted to making friends who shared my beliefs, and I even lost friends over petty arguments. Things started to change when I was in 8th grade, and the primaries for the next election started. I remember hearing Rush Limbaugh talk about Donald Trump entering the race. My dad wasn't a fan, but Limbaugh certainly was. The family would tune in for all the debates, and Trump was just, well, I don't have to tell you. He was the last person that we wanted to win. My favorite candidate was the senator from my state, Rand Paul. I was completely shocked that Trump gained so much traction in the primaries. To me, he came out of nowhere, and by the time he was the nominee, I had tried to distance myself from him, though I still defended him and would have voted for him over Clinton or Sanders. To put more space between myself and his movement, I started calling myself a libertarian or a classical liberal instead of a conservative or Republican. But my views only got further right-wing, in a quote-unquote small government way, with the fig leaf of supporting drug legalization and gay marriage. I started believing that taxation was theft and that the education system needed to be privatized, for example. Yeah, I thought market competition could fix anything. Trump's gross populism had driven me away from the Republican Party, but it oddly enough made my views further right-wing. I also began religiously watching content from the skeptic community on YouTube, devouring anti-feminist content like it was junk food. I followed this rabbit hole down until I was watching alt-right creators like Milo. There are two important issues during this time that help contextualize my views and how they were tied to creators more extreme than I was. Firstly, the Black Lives Matter movement was on the mind. The murders of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray especially influenced my ideas surrounding racial relations. I was constantly hearing how Brown was no angel, and the riots in Ferguson and Baltimore were sensationalized until I believed that BLM and Antifa were terrorist groups. Many of the YouTube creators I watched talked endlessly on the danger of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. The other event was the refugee crisis. I was initially skeptical of refugees from Muslim-majority areas after all the content I was fed speculating on ISIS militants sneaking in with them. I thought the risk wasn't worth it. Luckily, I met many refugees myself during this time, mostly from Iraq, and my positive experiences softened me up a bit. It wasn't an issue I was concerned with, but the YouTube channels which I had come for anti-feminist content were oddly obsessed with refugees, and they made sure to talk about that, in my opinion, secondary issue at every chance they could. You see, I didn't know what I was signing up with these creators. I went from watching Chris Ray Gun, Armored Skeptic, and Shoeonhead to more colorful content creators such as Stefan Molyneux, Lauren Southern, and James Alsop. Now, Yiannopoulos, Molyneux, Southern, and Alsop have all been revealed to be white nationalists. But watching them, I didn't notice. I never would have knowingly watched anyone who was a white nationalist. And even though I noticed people like Alsop getting more and more extreme, it never occurred to me how dark their views really were. How did I miss this then? Well, looking back with all that I know now, it seems fairly obvious to me. You see, every ideology is made up of different myths that combine to build up to a certain perspective. The biggest white supremacist myth, and the clearest sign that someone is a white supremacist, even if they won't recognize it, is that of the Great Replacement, or white genocide. This is the most fundamental myth to the white supremacist worldview today. The idea that immigrants from non-white countries are fundamentally incompatible with us, and they're flooding our country in order to erase Western culture or white civilization. The manufactured idea that white people are being replaced is critical for white supremacists. This made the climate surrounding the refugee crisis perfect for bad actors to swoop in and try to convert people like me into full-on extremists. In addition, one noteworthy component to the white genocide myth is that it can be even better explained by attributing these demographic changes to some elusive group at the top, pulling the strings, like the New World Order, or, more compellingly, Jewish people. My point is, once you get so far, we're easily in neo-Nazi territory here. The idea that the Jews are behind a white replacement is a staple of right-wing extremism. It's also fundamental to construct a danger on the left that unites people on the right of all stripes. A danger of violence, like that from Black Lives Matter or anti-fascists, will compel regular conservatives or even liberals to ally themselves with far-right extremists who claim that they are the only ones who can stop the violence and establish law and order. It doesn't dawn on these people that this violence really comes from the far right. Those were the key myths of the most extreme people I was influenced by. The fact that I was a viewer of people like Alsop disgusts me now, but I was easily manipulated by people who told me they wanted to protect me from anti-fascists, to protect me from anti-white and anti-male anger. The truth is that the danger wasn't coming from that side. How much did I buy into these myths? Well, I started a few political Instagram pages in my day, and looking back at some of the things I said can reveal a bit about the exact nature of my views. I was scared of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. I was scared of Islamic terrorism. I was susceptible to the idea that people in my white male demographic were the ones being discriminated against, and I thought racism and sexism had been solved to the best of the government's abilities. There were plenty of ingredients for a transformation to the extreme right that I'm glad the old me never thought to mix. The closest I came to becoming a certified member of the far right was right before the 2016 election, when I first heard about Pizzagate. I heard from my Instagram echo chamber that Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton and Democratic chairman John Podesta had participated in satanic rituals. I read that they had a secret code that clearly revealed that there was a child sex ring with the two of them involved as well. And for a while, I fell for it, at least a little bit, and I was astonished that the media wouldn't cover it. But these ideas didn't stay in my head for very long. Luckily, I didn't involve myself with people who believed the same thing, and I never doubted those who explained to me how absurd it was, and I felt like an idiot, because I was. Then, Trump won the election, and I was relieved. I didn't want Clinton in, even though I knew Trump would be bad too. Despite my general disdain for Trump, I was able to unite with people on the right by poking fun at everyone to the left of me. I could make fun of anti-Trump people. They seemed crazy to me. In early 2017, I went with a friend to a Trump rally in Kentucky. I remember pulling in and seeing all the protesters. Inside the arena, we cheered as a person ripped an anti-fascist flag out of the hands of an anti-fascist in the crowd. Trump never said anything memorable, really, but the image of that flag getting ripped away sticks with me. I started drifting to the left throughout the year following that rally. The political Instagram community that polarized me in the first place started drawing concessions from me after one of my favorite accounts started hosting live videos that made me think about my beliefs. I know that's weird. Instagram Live is where the first cracks in my echo chamber came from, but I began realizing the broken philosophy I had, starting with concessions at the inability of the market to care for the environment. And then a wave of obvious externalities came crashing onto me. Well, no, it didn't happen quite like that. It was a slow change influenced by my growing awareness of xenophobia around me, my love for the environment, fear of climate change, and oddly enough, the biggest motivator was my hatred for suburbia. I hated and hate the suburbs. This was my sophomore year of school, when I became homeschooled because of mental health issues. What privilege I had to do that, and I was incredibly isolated in my suburban home. I began tying various issues to suburbia, from climate change to de facto segregation to my own isolation. I felt robbed, living in the suburbs instead of a place where I thought I could feel at home. It's hard for me to explain this well in a concise way, but suburban sprawl was my white whale. And with that white whale, I finally began to really understand the extent of racial and environmental problems in this country, and more importantly, I finally felt allowed to be mad at it and to look for solutions. The next step in the metamorphosis was the recognition that it wasn't just these issues that sprang out of nowhere and that fixing zoning laws and stopping the suburbs would solve it all. I had to learn that these were huge systemic problems and the structures of power around me were all deeply flawed. Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. In order for you to understand how I was able to restructure my ideology this way, you need to understand one important thing. Right-wing ideology doesn't give a lot of room for criticism of systemic problems. I was finding all these issues, all these things that needed to be fixed, but it was all so interwoven, stemming from systems of power. But the right wing prefers to analyze problems through a different lens. The burden falls on individuals or single policies, people that can be denounced, and laws that can be tweaked. Systems at large must be protected because, after all, what else is the conservative there to conserve? Every problem is patched up with a band-aid or even ignored if the implications are too massive for the status quo to handle. Just look at climate change. The way I see it, right-wingers limit the scope of political issues so that they're solved through piecemeal reform or regression to a former state. As a consequence, they can't ever get to the root of an issue. So when a curious kid like me wants to know, how do we stop urban sprawl? Only one side provides a meaningful answer. When I ask, how do we stop climate change? One side calls it a Trojan horse for socialism. And they wouldn't need to do that if capitalism could solve the issues at hand. Okay. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself and I've already brought up the C word, capitalism. My mistake. I wasn't thinking like this at the time, by the way. Even when I slowly started moving left, I was explicitly neoliberal. I still thought capitalism and markets were the solutions, but I was getting dissatisfied with the Swansonian appeal to the free market. It just didn't seem to have as much humanity to it anymore. All this change was happening with Trump in the background, constantly turning up the notch on divisions and saying the quiet parts out loud. I had learned that the right wing historically relied on dog whistles, but now the euphemism was dead. Examples of racism and xenophobia were now more easily available to me. Not only was I now interested in learning about the systemic problems behind environmental issues, but I was learning about racial problems and the sources behind them. So, I used to think that individuals were responsible for racism in our society, that the government had done all it needed to do to fix the problems related to it. But once I looked into specifically housing and income disparities between white people and minorities, I saw that the issues at hand simply couldn't have stemmed from individual racists. This was a problem with a root, and I wanted to dig at that root. So, the first thing that took me left was my hatred for the suburbs I grew up in, oddly enough. I also started nurturing a love for reading that led me to the essayist and fellow Kentuckian Wendell Berry. His ideas for an emphasis on community and local economies really hit home with me. Even today, the particular vein of leftism I prescribe to is a bit more agrarian and localist thanks to his influence. But I learned a lot about the shortcomings of the market through him, and I found myself agreeing with practically everything he said. This idea of a thriving local economy is especially important. You see, I was becoming a liberal. Trump's travel ban on several majority Muslim countries was the thing that really did me in and cut me off entirely from the right. I was always staunchly opposed to the nationalism Trump exuded, but seeing how Republicans collapsed and followed along with it really took away all my faith. It took me a while to identify as anything else, liberal or Democrat, because of my childhood connection to these labels, but soon enough I was a definite liberal, supporting capitalism with reforms. But Berry's idea of a strong local economy is what did me in here. I didn't see how I could celebrate the extent of international capitalism and exportation from far-off countries when I learned from Berry that buying locally was important in order to curb alienation of labor and consume in a healthier manner. Oh boy. And I have just used my first bit of Marxist vocabulary of the video. I know, we're getting into scary territory. So, what is alienation of labor and how does it fit in here? Well, I think the best way to demonstrate it is with the example of food products. Take anything from your refrigerator. if you have apples or any kind of fruit or vegetable? Do you know where they were grown or who picked them? These microwave burritos in my freezer, I have no clue where the beef in it was slaughtered and who was involved in that process, and really anything else down the production line. The people picking the fruit and slaughtering the cattle never see the product of their labor. They don't know where it goes or who consumes it. This is applicable to basically everything consumed under capitalism. The point is that we're estranged from the products that we make as laborers, and as consumers, we are estranged from the laborers too. I find it dissatisfying that I'm sitting down to eat something and I know nothing about who was involved in getting that food to my plate. The context of alienation of labor and food is the most common, and most people can understand why it's unsettling not to know the source of what you physically consume. But the dynamic extends to all of our consumption. Behind everything you buy is someone who labored to produce it. They never get the satisfaction of seeing the result of their labor, so their profession becomes an empty way to get by on every paycheck instead of fruitful, satisfying work. The concept of alienation of labor frustrated me. I remember I followed this account on Twitter called Neoliberal, and they were showing off their merch, some stickers, and one of them had a cute illustration of a cargo ship, and it said, "Buy foreign." And even though I agreed with that account on so much, this statement just grossed me out. Why would you want to make a call to arms for people to buy from exploited workers in Bangladesh? Why would you want to divorce people from the product of their labor and separate the consumer from the labor? I don't know. I thought maybe that's just the price of modernity. Anyway, I love Wendell Berry. At the time I was struggling with my idea of place, my connection with Kentucky and where I lived. Maybe this sounds weird, but I felt robbed of a connection to any sense of home because of living in the suburbs. And my grandfather was a farmer. I remember going out to my great-grandpa's farm and riding the tractor and hearing stories about life out there. Do I sound like a country boy to you? I'm not. I grew up on a little concrete plot in Anywhere, USA, with an accent from Anywhere, USA. Please bear with me, because I know this seems like an odd thing to complain about, but I really treasured the values of some mystical rural life that I never led, but my grandparents did. I mean, my grandfather grew tobacco, so I've definitely been romanticizing it. But anyway, in my junior year of high school, I started working at a gardening center, and it was like, I was clearly out of my element. My boss called me a city boy, so I was frustrated with my position and my identity here. So, Barry, talking about the value of place, was like opium to me. There's one excerpt from one of his poems that really hits home, and it goes like this. Another place. It's enough to grieve me, that old dream of going, of becoming a better man, just by getting up and going to a better place. And yeah, that's how I felt. I couldn't connect to the world around me, and I wanted to leave and become unmoored from geography. But Barry made me reckon with my home, and while I was doing that, he helped shape my views quite a bit. There are some other good quotes I read that planted some seeds in my mind. One of them is this. Rats and roaches live by competition under the laws of supply and demand. It is the privilege of human beings to live under the laws of justice and mercy. Bookmark that point for a bit about the laws of supply and demand. And the other quote that I'm going to share is quite long, but I'm going to go ahead and read it in full length. In a society in which nearly everybody is dominated by somebody else's mind or by a disembodied mind, it becomes increasingly difficult to learn the truth about the activities of governments and corporations, about the quality or value of products, or about the health of one's own place in economy. In such a society, also, our private economies will depend less and less upon the private ownership of real usable property and more upon property that is institutional and abstract, beyond individual control, such as money, insurance policies, certificates of deposit, stocks, and shares. And as our private economies become more abstract, the mutual free helps and pleasures of family and community life, will be supplanted by a kind of displaced or placeless citizenship, and by commerce with impersonal and self-interested suppliers. Thus, although we are not slaves in name, and cannot be carried to market and sold as somebody else's legal chattels, we are free only within narrow limits. For all our talk about liberation and personal autonomy, there are few choices that we are free to make. What would be the point, for example, if a majority of our people decided to be self-employed? The great enemy of freedom is the alignment of political power with wealth. This alignment destroys the commonwealth, that is, the natural wealth of localities and the local economies of household, neighborhood, and community, and so destroys democracy, of which the commonwealth is the foundation and practical means. Okay, so in this weird semi-linear timeline I've created, I'm in my junior year of high school, 2 years back. Now, I don't want to divulge too many details, but that year I enrolled in a small Christian private school. I had struggled with school and my mental health, and going to a small school, and I mean this school was tiny, looked like it could help. And it did. But it also introduced me to a lot of people with very fundamentalist ideas. I mean, my science teacher didn't believe in evolution or climate change. And everything I heard around me just didn't connect with the new political views I was starting to form. In this extremely conservative school, I was able to see what was basically the antithesis of my imagined theology and philosophy. I love a lot of the people there, but it got pretty combative at times, and I was upset with this version of Christianity I was seeing. And I was really upset with the atmosphere in the school, where some of the kids were just spouting racial slurs like it was nothing, and I felt like we were being fed propaganda. So my time at the school helped me form my political views sort of in opposition to what was around me, and I would definitely see my time at Christian school as one of the most radicalizing factors that I had. I was exasperated by the guiding ideology there, and I wanted to make sure I could articulate my beliefs to the contrary. And luckily I had great friends there, and a few teachers who really helped me along. My favorite teacher really engaged me in talking about philosophy and history, and my conversations with him taught me a lot. Another one of my teachers knew my interests in political philosophy and gave me their used copy of the book by Will Kymlicka. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Contemporary Political Philosophy, which is how I learned about the works of John Rawls. Rawls had a famous thought experiment basically asking what sort of society you would pick if you had to choose from a veil of ignorance in which you know nothing about what characteristics you'll take. You don't know your race, or gender, or religion, talents, wealth, age, etc. If you knew nothing about yourself but wanted to live the best life you could, what type of society would you live in? Would you want to live in America with its lower social mobility, or a social democracy like those of Scandinavia? To me, the answer is obvious. Rawls was able to unite the ideas of freedom and equality, showing that they're intrinsically connected. And I believe you can't have a free society without an uncompromising devotion to equality. Everyone is inherently valuable and equally valuable. In my senior year of high school, the Democratic primary for the upcoming election started. My favorite candidate was Cory Booker until it really got down to the wire, and I was for Sanders. Now, if you had told me 4 years ago, even 2 years ago, that I'd be voting for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary as a registered Democrat, I would have called you crazy. At that time, though, I have fully committed to becoming a social democrat, essentially meaning I was still for capitalism, but with heavy modifications. This, in practice, was Sanders' ideology, and it's the ideology practiced in countries like Denmark. But even then, I didn't really understand what socialism and capitalism were, and I still held this idea that socialism could be dangerous, authoritarian, and extreme. By the way, this whole video I've neglected to discuss one element that's maybe influenced me the most, that is, BreadTube, or LeftTube, or whatever. Leftists on YouTube really helped shape my views, principally PhilosophyTube, ThoughtSlime, and Cody Johnston's Some More News. These channels introduced ideas that really challenged me and made me think through issues until I gradually held new positions. I'm glad that I allowed these people to challenge my ideas, and I encourage you all to check them out. Okay, we're getting to a point where I'm starting to open up about my current beliefs, and this involves some scary words like socialism that a lot of people I know immediately connect with incredibly negative traits. I had the same visceral reaction myself before, and I just want you to know that visceral reaction didn't come out of nowhere. You feel that reaction by virtue of learned behavior. So just take a deep breath with me and entertain the thought that this learned behavior doesn't come from an understanding of what socialism is, as much as an emotional reaction to associations that other people made for you. Firstly, I'm just going to clear up a pet peeve of mine. Leftists like me aren't liberals. I used to be a liberal, which means I fundamentally believed in capitalism, or at least a world where capitalism could be fixed, but now I don't, and that means I'm not a liberal but a leftist. And now I'm going to give you my definition of socialism and then take you on a little tour of the logical building blocks that led me to becoming a socialist. I'm a fervent believer in democracy, and I view socialism as an extension of democracy into the workplace. We take it for granted that so many of us live in a country where we can have a stake in our citizenship, where we can help influence outcomes through our votes and through political activism. We have a voice under liberal democracy, that's true. We are not subject to the whims of an autocrat at the helm. So why do we accept that in our workplace, where we spend so much of our lives? Why does anyone get to rule over you on virtue of having more capital to invest? Why don't we extend the principles of the Enlightenment into our work lives, where we can continue to grant ourselves more autonomy? I view this, by the way, entirely as an issue of autonomy, and I base many of my views around how I can give the most people the most autonomy. Liberal democracies increase autonomy in the political life, but there's more to be gained in this arena, and there's more to be gained in our work life. In other words, I believe it's a mistake to only apply the principles of democracy to the realm of city halls, courthouses, and capitol buildings. Why did we take up the principles of democracy and then carry them no further than the boundaries set up by the market? We don't have a true freedom until we conquer it in every facet of our lives. I'm being abstract here. More simply put, socialism advocates for the workers to own the means of production. For me, the ideal case study in worker ownership is the cooperative, an organization run collectively by the workers who share in the ownership. Cooperatives are already pretty common, meaning socialism is about as revolutionary as Ace Hardware. Yes, they are cooperative. Ace Hardware is leftist praxis. Now, the keystone to this socialist worldview is the idea of the labor theory of value. The value of something shouldn't be determined by its scarcity or the demand for it, but instead the amount of labor put into working on it. When we buy something, the price that we should be paying shouldn't be based on scarcity. That can be, and is often, artificially inflated, and the number is arbitrary and fluctuating. Besides, where's the humanity to this? As Wendell Berry said before, there is none. The person who really got the ball rolling for me on this matter, though, was Josiah Warren, known as the practical anarchist. In the 1800s, he set up a store in Cincinnati using labor theory of value, and it was pretty successful. Here's a nice quote from him to illustrate my point. At this point, society must attend to the rights of labor and settle, once for all, the great problem of its just reward. This appears to demand a discrimination, a disconnection, a disunion between cost and value. If a traveler, in a hot day, stops at a farmhouse and asks for a drink of water, he generally gets it without any thought of price. Why? Because it costs nothing, or its cost is immaterial. If the traveler was so thirsty that he would give $1 for the water, rather than not have it, this would be the value of the water to him. And if the farmer were to charge this price, he would be acting upon the principle that the price of a thing should be what it will bring, which is the motto and spirit of all the principal commerce of the world. And if he were to stop up all the neighboring springs and cut off all the supplies of water from other sources and compel travelers to depend solely on him for water, and then should charge them $100 for a drink, he would be acting precisely upon the principle on which all the main business of the world has been conducted from time immemorial. It is pricing a thing according to what it will bring, or according to its value to the receiver, instead of its cost to the producer. It will here be seen that prices are raised in consequence of increased want, and are lowered with its decrease. The most successful speculator is he who can create the most want in the community and extort the most from it. This is civilized cannibalism. The value of a loaf of bread to a starving man is equivalent to the value of his life, and if the price of a thing should be what it will bring, then one might properly demand of the starving man his whole future life and servitude as the price of the loaf. But anyone who should make such a demand would be looked upon as insane, a cannibal, and one simultaneous voice would denounce the outrageous injustice and cry aloud for retribution. Why? What is it that constitutes the cannibalism in this case? Is it not setting a price upon the bread according to its value instead of its cost? If the producers and vendors of the bread had bestowed 1 hour's labor upon its production, and in passing it to the starving men, then some other articles which cost its producer and vendor an hour's equivalent labor would be a natural and just compensation for the loaf. I have placed emphasis on the idea of equivalent labor because it appears that we must discriminate between different kinds of labor, some being more disagreeable, more repugnant, requiring a more costly draft upon our ease or health than others. This idea of cost extends to and embraces this difference. The most repugnant labor being considered the most costly, the idea of cost is also extended to all contingent expenses in production or vending. Anyway, I could talk about this all day, but I'll just leave it there and emphasize that the price you should pay for something should reflect the cost of the labor that it took to produce that thing, and that's not how the economy works. From this labor theory of value, we arrive at the next building block. The laborers providing the value are putting in more work than they are being compensated for. You see, in order for someone with employees to make a profit, he must pay workers an amount small enough to direct the earnings to him. As the employees work for small wages, the cost of the product they produced is fed directly up the tube to the capitalist employing these people. The workers create value, and then the value they create is bought, and the profit goes to the businessman in charge instead of the people who made the product in the first place. The final building block is what I like to think of as cutting out the middleman. The capitalist, who invests in his business and has his employees working under him, is essentially a middleman, injecting the capital into the business so the workers can make the products. Then the money made off selling the products is cheated from the workers so the capitalist can profit. But why do we need this middleman? Why don't the workers come together to own the means of production, create the products, and then equally benefit in their creation? Why must the worker follow this workplace autocrat instead of extending the democracy into the workplace, collecting the value that they created? Well, I'll leave you to think about that, but here's a hint. It might have to do with the fact that a liberal democracy isn't structured in a way that lends it towards true democracy. It functions as a protector of certain interests. I also need to point out that when I talk about the power relations involving people like capitalists, it's not an attack on any individual. A guy owning a small business isn't trying to exploit his workers and be an evil guy. The fault lies with the system. And nothing I say is a moral judgment here. The problems I'm attempting to solve are systemic, and at least for me, I don't base my beliefs off of someone's personal responsibility. In other words, individuals don't shoulder the burden of the exploitation under capitalism, but the fault instead lies with complex systems. I want to disentangle these systems. I don't want to put Jeff Bezos in a guillotine. Sorry. And yeah, that's at least my understanding of socialism, and it's what I believe. Remember, I am a baby leftist, though, and I could be mischaracterizing things. This is my ideology, and I don't want to speak for any broad groups. I want to maximize personal autonomy and affirm everyone's equal and intrinsic value. That's my maxim. So yeah, I went from a conservative to right libertarian to liberal to libertarian socialist. That's how I describe myself now. I was influenced heavily by Wendell Berry, John Rawls, and mostly, for my beliefs now, Josiah Warren. If you want to get a good look at my views and where they came from, look further into Josiah Warren. I discovered him in the book Utopia Drive by another fellow Kentuckian, Eric Rees, and he's really moved me into the philosophical space I'm in right now. I don't want to make this video longer than it already is, so I'll wrap it up here. I hope that gives you a good idea of my beliefs, and when I make videos in the future on politics, you might be able to see the position I approach things from. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you later.